Welcome to Blue Grit Radio, the podcast that explores making better cops for a better community. I'm your host, Eric Tung. I've been an active police officer since 2007. We will dive into the aspects of police culture, health and wellness, leadership, and mindset. You'll hear from experts not only from policing, but all industries as they relate to being our best with purpose, passion, and positivity. Join me as we share stories, lessons, and advice so we can all be better for ourselves, our teams, our families, and our communities. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the show. This is your host, Eric, and today I'm joined by the Dr. Rachael Goldmann. Dr. Rachael, thank you for being on the show.
Yeah, Rachel's fine.
I know. I'll switch it up. I like to acknowledge the title. I mean, that's a big deal. It takes a lot to get to that status. So, no, thank you so much for being on the show. And I just want to do a quick intro, and we're going to dive into it and hear it from you. But I got connected with Dr. Rachael here. She reached out after a friend found a moral injury article I wrote up for Police One. So to get the reached out on like LinkedIn and say, hey, this is what I'm doing. Your veteran background, and then working now, so focused on first responder wellness and mental health and moral injury. Like that's where we're going to get into as well. So super gratifying, super rewarding, and humbling to be connected in these big conversations in a kind of smaller community. It is a small community in a lot of ways, which is awesome. But yeah, thank you so much for reaching out. And when we had our first conversation, I was like, I knew that it would be a fantastic conversation to share with so many people. So we're just gonna dive in. But yeah, I'm gonna turn it over to you. Thanks so much for coming on again.
No, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk today. I mean, any opportunity I get to talk about police mental wellness and moral injury in particular, I will take. I will nerd out on it for however
we're
long.
Gonna do that. Yeah.
So I got out of the Marine Corps in 2007. I was hurt in a training accident. By training, I'm a combat photographer. So 2007, we were peacekeeping in Iraq and ramping up for Afghanistan. I was 2nd Marine Division, Camp Lejeune. So I was out in the field a lot and like prepping to go over. And I had like a pretty nasty like series of injuries, like a repetitive training incident where basically my feet just crapped out on me pretty hard. And I was out in about 6.5 weeks because at that time, like a non-deployable Marine is a useless Marine, and out I went. So I got home and was like, less than 2 years into a 5-year contract. And I had to figure out what I was going to do with the rest of my life. And then I finished my bachelor's in like communication with a minor in healthcare administration. And during that time, I got word of a couple of guys from my unit that had committed suicide after deployments. And I was like, what the fuck? Also, I will swear. My first language is swearing. My second is sarcasm. So that's
come on in. And we, for clarification, I think it's worth mentioning, but like very respectful. Dr. Rachael shouting out like, "Hey, like, are you good with swearing?" And I'm great with swearing. I try not to on recording, but that is part of my life as well. So no, it is very much of our community in a very respectful way. So please go on.
And I talk about that too, like where working with first responders, cops in particular, is very familiar to me because it feels so similar to being with like Marines, being with veterans in general. Like it's a huge part of our culture too, with swearing and like that way of expressing yourself. So I dedicated like my entire professional life to figuring out how to help my brothers and sisters after these suicides happened. I got my first master's in marriage and family therapy in 2014 and very quickly realized I am not that human. I am not that, let's talk about our feelings. Let's talk about the relationship. And like, it was just very like, that's not who I am. And I wanted to focus more on like individual aspects of things. And so I knew I wanted a doctorate. So I entered a doctoral program. I graduated from the Wisconsin School of Professional Psychology here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It's where I live and work. So home for me is the Midwest. You can probably hear it in my voice.
Hmm.
It's the don't you know, like I'm trying to like tamp that down a little.
It's okay. Be
Oh,
you.
it's such a, it's so funny because sometimes I've heard people like, they're like, what did you just say? Did you say bag? And I was like, bag. Like,
Yeah,
um,
big.
big. So
We say
I,
bagel, so like
bagel,
so. Yeah,
right? That's
so
what
many
I'm
people
saying, right?
say bagel, so it's kind of the same. Yeah.
Right. Or milk. Like, it's just, there's bubbler. Bubbler is like super Midwest, right?
What is a bubbler?
A water fountain.
Oh my goodness.
It's called a
Yeah.
bubbler, and it's not pop, it's soda.
Yeah. So I grew up on calling it soda because I was
Okay.
born and partly raised in Memphis.
Okay.
But yeah, bubbler is that's a new one for me. So
Bubbler, yeah.
I learned something today outside of the scope of what I was
Heck yeah.
projecting to learn about. So that's a nice surprise.
Midwest culture.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I worked my entire way through grad school, and part of what I did while I was in grad school um, was using my master's level. Like, I ended up getting licensed as an LPC, but I worked in the correctional world. So I worked for a year at a maximum security prison here in Wisconsin, and then started working at an intake facility in the city of Milwaukee, which is where I met my significant other, who is a correctional officer. He's not a felon. I also have to like clarify.
Sometimes that's a thing,
I
The
have,
heart wants what the heart wants.
man, I have stories. I worked with a psychologist
I'm
at the
sure.
prison who
Yeah.
lost everything because that's who she
Mm.
chose.
Oh
Um,
man.
oh yeah. So my partner's name is Travis, and we have a beautiful 3.5-year-old daughter. So
Yeah.
in all of that, I continued my way through school, studying anything trauma related, specifically with veterans. In 2016, I found the term moral injury. I was invited to a screening of a documentary, which, oh my gosh, I'm like blanking on the name right now. It's like Waking Dawn or something like that. And it used the term moral injury. And in 2016, it like hit me like a lightning strike that like this was my answer, because
Yeah.
PTSD, and like that conglomeration of symptoms
Hmm.
is very like bodily reactive, and like it's your brain kind of overreacting to a situation that hasn't occurred because it was based on prior experience.
Hmm.
Moral injury was like the aftermath, like the soul wound of what happens, and it accounted for way more than than what I than what anybody really could imagine. So like PTSD is a very specific subset of criteria. So you have to meet a criterion A trauma. So threat of life to yourself, the threat of life to somebody that you know, a sexual assault. So like those big criterion A traumas, like major car accidents, like because your life is threatened, like that kind of stuff.
Hmm.
Moral injury accounts for other things that aren't those criterion A traumas and cause more, if not like the same or more of distress, which
Yeah.
we'll get into.
Yeah.
Um, but after 2016, that became my my focus, and understanding and educating myself and others and treating moral injury. It comes out of the veteran research. It has been around since 2009 as like that type of a term. But as we talked about on the phone, like moral injury as the warrior's curse. We have had warriors in all aspects of society and cultures for forever, from the dawn of
Hmm.
time. And so this this ache, this wound has existed in all warriors essentially, or like most impacted warriors. The potential exists for moral injury to occur.
Yeah.
I'm also going to say potentially morally injurious a lot, because resiliency is a huge part of life, especially in the first responder world.
Hmm.
So not every morally injurious experience guarantees the experience of a moral injury, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, 2018, I found the first responder world. I was contacted by a wellness team in our area to help with officer debriefs after Officer Mike Mahalski was murdered in the line of duty. Um, he served in the Milwaukee Police Department, and the scene was huge. My reputation had kind of preceded me as like somebody who does that kind of work, works well with first responders, and I helped them out, and I haven't looked back since. And that's how I
Mm.
found um, like policing and public safety psychology, which is like the subset of psychology is what we in the psychological will call it. because it encompasses all public safety. So corrections, law enforcement, fire, EMS, Department of Natural Resources, federal law enforcement, like runs the gambit. So I haven't looked back since, and my dissertation was on moral injury of police officers. It was one of the first and only studies to actually look at the specific symptoms of moral injury in policing, which is where I found a lot more information. And I still kind of to this day wrestle back and forth with like, what do I fucking do?
Mm.
Because with veterans and moral injury, like those experiences end, right? Like a lot of these experiences manifest out of war,
Yeah.
and their war ends. Like they
Yeah.
physically leave a war zone and then they come
Hmm.
home. Police are in it every day. It
Yeah.
doesn't
It's
end.
just your life, right?
Yes, it is
Hmm.
shift after shift. Like that's what you've chosen to do for 25 years, maybe, you know?
Yeah.
So that I go back and forth on and like, how do I attack this? And how do I talk about it? So like the easiest way to start talking about it is to kind of talk about morality in general, which is a fun
Mm.
conversation.
Yeah. All right. Well,
So
let's I want to cut back a little bit, and I'm making some
yeah.
notes here, and so we're going to jump back into morality and like getting into like what is moral injury for those that aren't familiar. And part of that's like I wasn't familiar for the longest time, right? You talk about shoot, like it originating back in '09. I came into first responder work in '07, and easily by 2009. I'm not positive, but I was already involved with our peer support team, and I was starting to learn more about resilience and mental health. And so I've always been like an advocate, but more like a soft advocate, like a kind of passive, kind of peer supporter, I suppose, until I promoted, like many years later, and then started really doing the deep dive. But even through all that, right, and even
Hmm.
through getting more involved with my program, growing that, trying to be helpful and relevant and regionally, and then even to the point where it's starting this whole social media and podcasting, kind of different project. Like I was still like foreign to it until just a couple years ago, like just hearing it. And then that's part of why I wrote the article, is just to say like, hey, luckily we're having increased conversations about that. um, to your point, yeah, PTSD, PTSI, PTS, whatever way you want to call it, like that's something that we are now well socialized in, and people have a whole varying degree of how well that they feel like they're navigating their undeniable PTS exposure, right?
Hmm.
But some people find it very debilitating, and many do not. And then they're like, okay, I get it, but then what beyond that? And I think you put it so well when you're like, yeah, this is a soul wound, right? It's like it's an injury, it's damage to your soul, and that's something that like I think that everyone needs to just kind of sit and kind of marinate for a second, because yeah, we can talk about physical rehab, we can talk about mental rehab in some ways, right? And these traumas, and we move alongside or past them at times, but then you have this thing that's jarring to your soul, and then you call in all these things about like purpose and like
Hmm.
your value system that is so much like the compass that brings people into military work or first responder work generally in the first
Yep.
place.
Yeah,
So there's a lot
absolutely.
there.
Well, because society has always needed warriors and protectors, right? So from the dawn of time, we have required that there's expectations of like social rules, right? So like that's our inherent human agreement to obey and like treat others with like respect, and like I'm not going to take more of the resources that you need because I'm just going to take what I need, so that the greater good of the group isn't hindered. Or like I'm not going to walk down the street and just punch you in the face, like it's
Hmm.
there's this agreed upon moral like
Like
feeling and
code,
ethics,
yeah,
right? Code,
yeah. There's like a way of life that you
right?
agree upon, yeah.
Right. And so like in society, those of us who choose to enlist or go into like the police force feel a sense of honor related to that code, right?
Mm.
So we're signing up to do jobs that nobody else wants to do or can do, um, to be used in such a way that protects those rules. So like then you go and you think about what that all means, and thinking about like morality and ethics, and when something goes against those ethical codes or like that moral like compass, and there's something called moral pain, right? um there should be. So like the thing that's difficult about moral injury and treating moral injury is that I don't want people to habituate or just get used to feeling guilt. I don't want people to get used to feeling shame. It's a balance. I need you to get used to living with it
Mm-hmm.
and actually experiencing it, because those are not fun emotions to experience. And much like PTS, the thing that amplifies that PTS symptom presentation is avoidance. If you don't deal with your shit, it's going to get worse because it gets buried alive,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I just mentioned how veterans get to come home and unpack it. Police have to go back day after day, call after call. Do they ever get a chance to unpack it? Not really. um, and you have to be able to like go to that next call. You can't always sit with your feelings. You can't sit with like the shame or the guilt that might manifest from
Mm-hmm.
a morally injurious experience. And like with moral injury and what accounts for moral injury. So moral injury um, is like the aftermath of what happens when there is moral pain or something that is potentially morally injurious, which can occur if you do something, if you see something, if something is done to you, or you don't do something
Yeah.
like in that brushes up against those violations of ethics. So it accounts for so much. There's part of like a presentation that I do that talks about like killing guilt.
Mm.
So interesting. Um, but like when you're looking for those experiences and they pop up and you're like, ooh, I'm not feeling so great about that call, right? Like I just showed up to a domestic violence call and like I couldn't do more than what I just did. Now that's not a criterion A trauma for PTSD, right? Like that's not, there was no threat of life to you or anything like that. And it could stay with you because you didn't do everything you felt like you should do.
Mm-hmm.
So like PTSD, I heard it explained as like what is, and moral injury is what it ought to be.
Yeah, and that's man, that's like I mean, that's the crux of what we're talking about, what I was writing about, but more than ever I would argue to police officers have that struggle
Mm-hmm.
because there's so much we want to do, so much we intend to do, so much we signed up for that we felt and feel so disempowered. And laws are one aspect, culture and staffing and just organizational operational feasibility is another, right? And I provided a couple examples in my article, but as far as all that, like there's so much that cops want to do, but like when you talk about morale being so low, like that
Yeah.
is case in point so much of why, right? It's like those that have chosen to stay or to support and work alongside, whether it's sworn or civilian or folks like you, like there's so much more that we all want to do, but we just
Mm-hmm.
see like not to be doom and gloom, but like you watch the news, and partially why I try not to watch it very often. But
Yeah.
like you see all this stuff, and I do kind of throw shade at the traditional media for fear mongering and such. But
Yeah.
there's a lot of really bad stuff happening out there. Like that's a real thing that first responders are very much wanting to do more about, and it's so jarring to the conscience to not be able to.
Yeah, because I mean, when you're handicapped by your rules of engagement or like SOPs and things like that, or here in Milwaukee, like Milwaukee Police Department has a lot of like ACLU stuff that they have to account for and comply with.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and like it's so hard because I mean, in 2020, policing changed, like reality, like
Yes.
policing super duper changed. Um, and like the struggle is like the pendulum swung one way so completely, and now we're kind of seeing like what happens like when morality like breaks down a bit, right? Like if there is nobody to uphold the laws get broken,
Mm-hmm.
period.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
So like we went from we don't want police to like why aren't you guys here, and it's like told us to get out.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. And there's man, like even just to use like an example, right? Like where society, let's just say, and I know some people are like, well, not everyone, right? The
Sure.
silent majority and all these things, but like let's just say, like, let's call what it is and what happened. But the large predominant governing forces, to include the government and those that put them into power,
Hmm.
we're calling for a lot of action and a lot of reform and all these things, and some good, some not good. Regardless, it left so many police departments with leaders, and that's line leaders, that's division leaders, that's organizational leaders saying like, okay, you want less cops, we're going to make it happen, right? Like fewer actual, right, as far as like cuts, but then also presence and the type of policing, like proactive policing is
Yep.
kind of a buzz that people are like, man, like young cops don't know how to quote unquote proactive police. But not to go down that rabbit hole, but like you had a depolicing occur
Hmm.
for so many ways and reasons, and you had some leaders saying like, hey, we're just adapting to what the public wants. Like some people are just they're trying to be unemotional about it and like, hey, weather the storm. But we have to recognize that how much that really messed with officers to hear that, even though they're like, yeah, I wish we could do more, but now our leaders are saying, yeah, do less. If they don't want us there, we won't be there, we'll wait around, right? But like again, like a lot of this conversation, or the conversations I try to have on here, are like painting and trying to share some empathy, because some of those leaders, like, yeah, did they pander or whatever, like we could put labels on it, but ultimately, like if they're trying to help the organization survive and help their officers survive the liabilities and such, like that might have been the best way that they knew how. I think that sometimes, like, you look at it like a parent, did our parents necessarily know the best ways? Maybe the best they knew how, and I think that that's best to be able to try to offer some grace. At the same time, we saw leaders that were like, they threw their flag in the sand and they're like, nope, this is how we do things. And those, many of those leaders, unless they're like a very, you know, a sheriff or something in a certain type of area, like many of those leaders were shown the door.
Yes.
And then they have to grapple with that too, because they're like, man, now I'm not there to protect my men and women, and I could have maybe been more diplomatic, coulda, woulda, shoulda, right? And then we're talking about
What
another,
ought to be.
angle of, yeah, what ought to
Hmm.
be. We're back to moral injury, right? And so people walking away and having to choose why they stay, why they go. That's so much to grapple with, because this is, in so many ways, as many people recognize, it is a calling. So it's more
Hmm.
than like a vocation.
Yes,
So yeah, I'm
absolutely.
just throwing around a lot of angles and ideas for the listeners just to kind of chew on.
Well, and part of like moral injury can be making decisions in an event that's uncertain. Like one of the most predominant definitions that we came out in like 2019 is like the decisions and choices that are made in a really high stakes environment. So like I don't know how much more high stakes you get than politicking and like deciding the course of action for your agency. Like it's so challenging to think about, and like recognizing that the ability and like moral injury, so like moral injury is this like amalgamation, this conglomerate of like
Yeah,
symptoms,
yeah.
right? So like it's something, it's nothing that we try to like pathologize, right? Like that's the thing about moral injury is I don't think, and I do go back and forth, that it shouldn't be in the DSM, because then you're looking at pathologizing and trying to like decrease guilt and shame and like questioning self and questioning others. And um it's
Yeah.
a and it becomes an impact. Like so like there are times where like have you had a nightmare? Yes. Right. Have you avoided things because they're going to be unpleasant? Yes.
Mhm.
Have you like maybe worked too much or drank a little too much one night? Sure.
My goodness, yeah, right.
Right, like have you been like hyper vigilant at any point in time? Yes, right. All of us could say yes to that, but those individual yeses don't lead up to PTSD altogether, because it's like one of, and then like the impact of. So whenever we look at pathology, we look at how that pathology impacts a person on their day to day. So like moral pain and experiencing moral pain, um, if you actually engage with it and talk about shame and talk about guilt, won't cause moral injury usually. Where we get that moral injury is that avoidance again, is where we take this thing that's happened and it gets buried alive. And then it
Mm-hmm.
comes out and it's like this nasty mangled thing, but it's alive. So looking at shame and guilt, loss of trust in yourself, loss of trust in others, the existential crisis, and component of it, which can also account for like it's spiritually adjacent. So the existentialism is spiritually adjacent. Is how I kind of talk about it,
Mm-hmm.
because there's moral injury came from like a very spiritual perspective on things, and I think that's where we lost a lot of people with it. So if we talk about existential and purpose as being spiritually adjacent and like moral authority and like that kind of stuff, it makes it more accessible to people.
Yeah.
um so like starting to question that, like, what is my purpose? Like, I've seen these shit things I've had to do, like subpar work. I've had to compromise myself over and over and over again. What does
Mm-hmm.
it mean? So then you start having that angst. And then maybe you work more to avoid that angst. Maybe you drink more real easy to avoid those like those feelings. Maybe other risky behaviors manifest. Gambling, sex, like all that fun stuff, right? Where it's like, I'm going to just go balls deep into this and avoid thinking about my pain.
Yeah.
Well, what happens? Then you have calling into work because you're hungover or still drunk. Maybe you're too depressed to get out of bed. You're too anxious to load and carry a firearm. Like, so many things manifest from it. That's the moral injury, right? That's what we're talking about, is like those intrusive type of symptoms that disrupt the life, not necessarily like the shame and guilt that accompanies the action. Because like I said, we don't want to habituate to that. We don't want to get used to that. We don't want somebody to not feel shame. If you feel shame, it means that you sense that you've done something wrong and you're seeking to correct it in one way, shape, or form. Again, which is why this is so difficult for first responders, because
Mm-hmm.
you're going to do it again and again and again. So it's
Yeah.
uh it's an interesting concept to think about.
Yeah, and those are some huge topics, right? Like, I
Mm-hmm.
think most listeners are like, yes, like gambling, sex addiction, all these things, like, you just unreliability at work, right? You're not effective. You're not operational. Like, those are those are big issues that do face our community. Many people listening will be like, okay, cool, like that's not me. But I think like what I want to explain, or maybe what I want to kind of rewind to, is like they don't have to be that. We're talking about those are the
Mm-hmm.
kind of the bigger manifestations. But even something as simple as like, man, like the last 3 times I filed on a case like this, I got a decline, and so why bother? And then so you feel guilty, you're part of the system, and then you start deprioritizing the victims out there and deprioritizing your work. And then because that's not you, that's not why you came in, like you feel really crappy about that, right? So maybe you work more overtime to provide for your family and justify like this is a good job where I can make money and I can provide good things. But then you're working more and you're more tired, and then you're more dejected, and you're more like your absenteeism is skyrocketing because you're working so many hours and you don't have the energy to put into all these cases that you think are useless anyway. And so, but again, because it's not you, it's not how you like to be, then you feel even crappier about that whole situation, that like you're just basically driving around a black and white for like no
Mm-hmm.
real apparent reason except to provide like you know some dollar bills in your bank account.
Right.
um yeah, and then you can get into spending, and these are like back to the categorical
Right.
symptoms. Or you're out there and you don't resonate with the culture because you're out there trying to do everything, and your literal partners are like, you are going to get me into some crap, and we're going to be blasted by maybe the district attorney, or that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And that feels bad for everyone involved, because some people are like, hey, we got to do our job, and other people are like, I'm trying to protect you and me, and this is not the time or place to push the envelope. Then you got bosses, you got unions, and they're all trying to do their best. And I think that, again, like sometimes we get too leaned into one way or the other, and then we start infighting. And I mean, what is a better climate for moral injury than things like organizational betrayal, and not even
Yes.
knowing like you're on the same page with the other people that you want to feel safe, you want to feel secure around. And it's like that's such a struggle right now.
Yeah, because moral injury inherently seeks to isolate, right? Like, if somebody is struggling with something morally injurious, they're going to typically go inside of themselves. like they're not going to talk about it necessarily, because owning up to that shame or guilt, again, we talked about it as being difficult. And so when you have humans who are inherently social and then isolating themselves, and the culture of policing has changed, because now it's like, I can't trust my brother, I can't trust my sister, like I feel like I'm going to be backstabbed, or they're going to throw me under the bus for whatever reason. um, it sows that type of dissent and like reinforces the belief of isolation. Like, you are an island, you're alone, but you're
Mhm.
not, like, but moral
Yeah.
injury tells you are. um, Especially with like the depressive and aspect of it and the shame.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're looking at like so many different forms of uh, like purposelessness, right? So if yes, you're filing those cases again and again and again, and it's not getting charged, it's not getting charged, not getting charged, like why bother, right? um so many people get into policing, like if we're looking at like the peers of who came into policing and when, like there's this cohort of like the 10 to 17 years right now who are really struggling. They're
Mm.
very much struggling because of feeling inept, of feeling like they're not being allowed to do what they signed up to do, and so they're leaving or
Yeah.
they're suffering, or both,
Mhm.
really. Like they leave and they suffer, they stay and they suffer, um, because they're having to find new meaning in the job, in a job that was amongst the noblest of jobs and like difficult to get into, is not anymore. And you're
Yeah.
like, who are these new people?
Hmm.
um yeah.
No, and if I want to cut in, like that's my peer group, right? Like I'm hitting 17 years this summer, and so
Mm,
like I mean that's a lot of why I started doing all the social media, is like refinding that purpose. And for a while that was like trying to just focus on, you kind of gave a nod to it earlier, right? Like resilience. Like we don't end a deployment in police, right? We don't come
mhm.
back home and like readjust. And I'm not at all trying to say it's easy for military folk. Like, and by the way, thank you for your service. I made a note, but then we just took off. So all that to say, like, yes, it is just different. And
Yeah.
so that was a lot of my purpose, like kind of like, hey, like let's focus on what we can focus on, which is our own personal health and supporting each other, peer support, all these things I know and love. And then hiring reignited my purpose, because there were people that wanted to come in, and like that was the most viable thing, like hands-on thing I could do to help like my agency, my region, whether or not like whether or not I could do a lot for it, I was going to try.
Yeah.
So I feel very grateful to have those experiences, and a lot of people didn't have something quite as tangible, but in the ways I could, it was just to try to remind people, hey, if you're a cop wearing a uniform, you can be a recruiter if you want. If you don't have to, you can be an advocate. And I think that I've seen surveys that are reflecting a change in tide, right? Like we're getting more people hired. That's great, nationally. At the
Mhm.
same time, like there are fewer people, yeah, I believe this is true, but there are fewer people that would turn others away from the job than a few years ago, right? So the
Yes.
numbers are actually looking like they're reflective of that, which is very positive. We're trending in the right direction. But I say all that to say, like, yeah, I mean, it's case in point, like resilience. Like, what are the things that jump out to you, as we've covered a lot of ground with like moral injury, the different aspects affecting, contributing, and resulting? Where do you like to steer people to start and grappling with a lot of these things, as listeners are like, okay, yeah, like I'm hearing what she's putting down, and like now what? Like, what do I do? Where do I go?
I mean, step one is obviously feeling your feelings, right? So it's a really adaptive mechanism in policing to cut yourself off from emotion, right? So like to live in the gray because of the distress that you feel on the job, of the things that you see. The only problem with that is when you cut yourself off from like the negative emotions, you also cut yourself off from the positive ones too. So life is like,
Hmm.
okay, life is fine. uh, but could you really remember the last time you were truly happy or joyful? And for a
So
lot
you're
of
like
people,
numbing yourself, right?
yes, the answer is
Hmm.
no, because you don't just get to selectively cut off the negative emotions. All of it gets cut off. It's not like I mean, you can spot train. I use like the example in like the gym of like, all right, I'm gonna just do bis and tris. All right, well, in the course of doing bis and tris, you're also doing shoulders and core and leg as well, because your whole body is connected. Your
Mm.
whole emotional experience is connected. So if you cut yourself off from one, you cut yourself off from the rest. So the first thing that I talk about with my people is like, you got to start feeling your feels. Like, you have to understand that anger is a default, right? So we talk about when I was in Marine Corps, it was caffeine, nicotine, and hate, right? So that's what got you
Mm.
going, because that's what we needed at the time. Um, and having to like refocus from that context, which is also really important. Like, policing, the job is the context, but it stays with you in like other aspects of life too, which is why cutting yourself off from negative emotion on the job, as adaptive as it is, also impacts home life and like interpersonal relationships, and your ability to parent, to love, to care, um, to exist in like some happiness. So
Yeah.
step one is like acknowledging that there might have been some emotional cutoff, and like garnering some emotional intelligence about what that actually means. Um, because somebody's saying to me like, I'm just angry all the time. Sure. uh Anger serves its purpose, right? Anger tells you when something unfair or unjust has happened. Anger protects you because it's strong and powerful, in that like, when you are angry, like your whole system comes online, like the fight, flight, or freeze response, that stress response comes online, and so you become bigger, badder, faster, stronger. Problem is, you're doing it with like your wife or your husband or like a kid, so people who are angry, it's really easy to stay away from them,
Mm-hmm.
like, so it serves its purpose, right? So like, if I'm angry, people will stay the fuck away from me. They're not going to ask me for anything. I just get to sit here and be in my shit.
Mm-hmm.
More isolation,
Yeah.
more opportunity to sow dissent in that morally injurious experience, right? So anger is powerful because, in turn, in keeping people away from you, people are convinced like, oh, well, now people can't see me for who I think I really am, which is that idea of shame, right? Like, shame is for me, was my answer as to why suicidality runs rampant in like the veteran community. So like, guilt says you did something bad. Shame says that you are something bad, right? So like, there should be an element of shame. Like, if you over like if you steal from a store, right? Like, you should feel guilty because you broke a law. Beyond that, though, what that means is like, the next person is going to pay more for the cost of that good because you stole from that store. So there should be shame attached to that to help a company like the straight and narrow, right?
Sure. Like a course correction.
Correct. So looking then at where police officers and veterans feel shame is where their honor was not like forefront in their decisions. So then they're like, fuck, I am a piece of shit. I didn't do what I should have done, what ought to be. I didn't do that thing. I'm an awful human. So now they think this of themselves. External shame is believing that everybody else sees it too. So when that starts happening, if you believe everybody else sees that you're a piece of shit, why wouldn't you contemplate killing yourself?
Hmm.
Like, you're going to do everybody a favor and take yourself out. So that's from my experiences working with people who have had like chronic suicidality and like suicide attempts. They were so convinced they were doing the world a favor by
Yeah.
removing themselves from it. And that's because they felt so shameful about who they were as a person and thought everybody else saw it too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there's so much there, and I think ultimately like that's a topic I don't speak a ton about, and
Mm-hmm.
I haven't had it personally affect me super closely. I've had friends that have been suicidal, and I
Mm-hmm.
feel very grateful that I haven't lost anyone super close. But and I know that there's so many shows that focus like largely on that topic. But I think that's a key thing for us to all realize, and I do like to put it in terms like this, which is that we talk about wellness and resilience and, health and being active and, having networks and communities, all these great things. But like really at the very crux of it, like the main thing we want to avoid is people uh, killing by suicide, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I've heard it put this way, whereas I remember, man, like I feel like this was pretty common ideology or common thing to kind of say or react to like a decade or two ago, where you'd say like, oh yeah, like how could someone be so selfish to think about themselves in that way and create this burden, like those that had to find them, their family, like how selfish. But like the flip is like that was the most selfless thing that they felt they could do, because that's how jarred their reality is. Like that's how much
Mm-hmm.
hurt and pain and shame they're feeling. And so I think that that's like a very important thing to remember as we are first responders, and we got to think about our brothers and sisters, but also like we go to a lot of like people like with a lot of stuff going on, and
Yeah.
a lot of times it's suicidal ideation, sometimes it's that repetitive that we see in the job, which is that like, yeah, that person's been talking about suicide or taking pills how many times, or actually like stabbed themselves in the chest like how many times. Like you kind of, because your own, like you're trying to navigate your own conscience and uh the emotions there, it becomes kind of conditioned to that. But ultimately, like that's a big freaking deal, and for someone
Mm-hmm.
to be feeling that amount of hurt, I think that we do need to compartmentalize to an extent to get through the day to day. But yeah, that is a lot to grapple with.
And then when you think about it in terms of like your peers, like somebody's walking around with that level of distress and still coming to work because they haven't done it yet. You know what I'm saying? Or like
Hmm.
maybe they've had the firearm in their hands and they're looking at it and then they
Yeah.
put it away. Like there's so many of those. Like a lot of that popped up in my research where it was like very seldomly did a respondent say they hadn't thought about suicide.
Mm.
um, because I mean, there's suicidal ideation, and then there's passive suicidal ideation, and there's suicidal like intent. So like for our world, the psychology world is like passive ideation is like, I wish I just wouldn't wake up in the morning. Like that would be great. Or like maybe a car will take me out on my way to work. Like that's passive ideation. Very common in like the veteran worlds. We're an angsty bunch, and so suicidal ideation it's joked about like and whatever, but like very real. And then you
Hmm.
up the ante to like suicidal ideation. Like I have thought about doing it, and then you go into like intent and plan, and then that's where we start to pay like much more attention, and like safety planning and like that kind of stuff pops up. Like my distress tolerance for talking about suicide is probably pretty high, um only because I live and walk in the darkness, right? Like um I tell people, uh I may not have been in your shoes and I'm not wearing your boots, but I can walk with you, like,
Hmm.
and so let's do it. um and I find that that is almost refreshing in a lot of ways to start talking about it, because then you find out like a lot of it is morally injurious stuff that has
Mm.
happened, right? And you can apply it to so many different realms. Like more and more research is coming out about like childhood abuses and like that kind of stuff, and closely connected to the ACE study. And um, because how you see yourself in the world is inherently an attachment issue. So when something happens that makes you question your purpose, your safety, your physical space and place, that's an attachment issue. So like it goes back even further um, than we might have even thought. And the manifestation of what is happening now is so distressing that that's where we're headed. We're headed to like that really dark place.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a lot. And I did want to kind of rewind back because I have my own reflection when you're talking about anger. I've
Mm-hmm.
told the story countless times, on or off recording, but I talk about like my cynical chapter, and it's certainly not just like one chapter that goes in waves, right? But like, uh, certainly to the point where I was a newer cop, um, and I was so cynical, and I was around this really toxic energy at work, and people were the subjects we're quote unquote dealing with, right? They're all shitheads and this and that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I hadn't really even put the concept on that my anger and my extreme cynicism around people outside of work, my friends and family. Like I call them out in a positive light to say like, hey, like you got to keep your accountability buddies close, even if it feels tough. Like that's a sign that you need it even more, and you need to invite that criticism preemptively, because they care. But like truly, that's what happened, and I am now sitting in this with this thought of like, yeah, I think a lot of that was the culture that I was exposed to was very jarring to me. Like
Mm-hmm.
I grew up like a very rule follower, and I'm introduced to this element that certain aspects of it I think can be helpful when you're dealing with very violent, very awful people doing awful things. Like some of that mentality, like us versus them. I get it, right? Like I think that it may be helpful for some of the listeners to hear, like, because I'm not all going to be like rah rah, and I probably come off that way, right? I'm like, hey, no, like treat everyone professionally and all these things, especially being a boss now, but like that is the goal. But at the end of the day, like it doesn't mean you have to like the people, right? It just means you treat them with respect and you treat them the best you can. But sometimes you gotta answer, fight fire with fire. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but to recognize that like the transition was so hard for me that I didn't feel great about some of the things I was doing, some of the things I was saying, some of the things I was thinking, and the job of policing is certainly not everything I imagined it would be. It has its dark
What?
stuff, yeah. Like especially because I didn't grow up with any, like, and that's part of my story too, is like not growing up with any cops or like in my family, or
Yes.
certainly I didn't even have really many people in the military community except for like a great uncle, overseas, back in Taiwan. Like he was a career, essentially Marine. But outside of that, like just how morally injurious like my psyche and my environment was for me, especially being as kind of young and uh, emotionally unintelligent in a lot of ways, right? And
Mm-hmm.
life lessons being learned at a very rapid pace, through that scope of being a full-fledged sworn police officer in a high crime area. Like that was a lot. So um, that's me thinking out loud. But at the same time, I think that is a lot that I would invite the listeners to consider, as they're going through their own stuff. Like they're coming into the hiring environment and they're interacting with people that are really salty, or they're interacting with people that say some kind of messed up things. And like when they're questioning whether they want to be a part of that, like don't think that you have to become that. But at the same time, like just recognize like it's a thing. You can navigate it, you can process it, you can talk about it, like feel your
Mm-hmm.
feelings. I think that was a great takeaway that I love, and a phrase that you put out. But at the same time, like just have grace for the people around you and yourself as you start navigating that.
One of the elements, the items that I asked about when I was looking at my research was an interaction with a member of the community kind of like changed how I saw them. So like they became more human to me. Um, so like that whole aspect of fuck, like now I'm seeing them in a different way, where I saw it this way and now I'm seeing it another way, and like what does that mean about me, what does that mean about them? And so figuring out all of that together, and knowing that the reckoning will come, like I know it sounds ominous, but like there is going to be a day where you avail yourself of your police powers, you retire, you turn in your badge, you're gone, your duty belt, everything goes away, and then you're left with just yourself. And so making sure you're in on the path of like truly taking care of you. And we talk about like ancient culture and like what to do about moral injury. That's the next question. Is like, what do we do? What do I do? Can I go to
Mm-hmm.
therapy? Sure, absolutely. So talking about like grief, it's a big one, right? Because moral injury and like those experiences is all just a very, for me, I boil it down to very complex grieving, because it is a loss. It's a loss in a lot of ways. And so attacking it from that perspective makes it a little bit more digestible talking to a therapist. Because like I said, you don't want to habituate clients to shame and guilt. And as a provider, a lot of us, when we have our client sitting in front of us and they're feeling shame, we feel it too, right? And that's so uncomfortable. And we want to alleviate that. But it's not my job to tell you don't feel bad. Because if you fucking did something that evoked that response, I don't want to take that from you. You need it. You need it. You need that honor, that accountability. So it's hard to do this work and to actually get into it more, because it requires like tolerance on the side of the provider as well.
Mm.
Um, I have found a ton of benefit. I don't know if have you heard about ketamine assisted psychotherapy at all?
Yeah.
So, I mean, in the relative scheme of things, for me, like I'm still not comfortable with like IV ketamine. Like that's just I don't. It's for me. It's just. uh. But when I think about like the ancient cultures and like the medicine men and the shaman and like all of those people who helped ancient civilizations, not even ancient civilizations, but like indigenous civilizations and cultures to like find their way and find their righteousness, a
Mm.
lot of it was done with psychedelics, and like moderated psychedelics. I'm not saying go
Yeah.
out and like buy all the mushrooms. No,
Yeah,
like,
don't just like book a don't just book a trip south of the border and be like, I'm looking for some spiritual guidance.
right.
Um, yeah,
Yeah,
just
don't do that.
yeah,
Don't do that.
vet your professional, I
A
suppose. I
hundred
don't.
percent vet the
Yeah.
person who is providing you with this journey. So ketamine assisted psychotherapy is a new, I want to say, new realm for people. It's the closest right now that we can get without using scheduled narcotics and like things that are illegal. Even in microdosing, there's been some really great research out of Rush University in Chicago with combat veterans and microdosing with psilocybin, microdosing with ecstasy,
Hmm.
um, all of that. But like ketamine assisted psychotherapy, not just like taking ketamine and tripping balls, like you're you're in a room with a licensed provider, you've had a physical, you're clear, and you have intentions set and like you know what you want to do. Ketamine literally, so it what these psychedelic what the psychedelics do and what ketamine does is opens up all these neurons that have like wired together. So neurons that wire together fire together, right?
Hmm.
That's the very basis of response in any way, shape, or form, whether it's shame, guilt, hypervigilance, startle response, any of that. Like these opportunities, these interventions open up those neurons and create something we call neuroplasticity. And so when you're neuroplastic, it allows you to shape again and create better pathways
Hmm.
for health and like inviting these experiences in. I will tell you, I have had 2 people on my caseload go through this, and it took our therapy light years.
Oh
It
wow.
was incredible. Um, and it's something that it's not something you do every day. It's something that I would maybe do like quarterly to like get set and do and then continue the journey. Um, but having the chance to create a neuroplastic state where you can look at your shame and like actually deal with it. It's so I can't it was humbling, I guess. I'm coming
Mm.
back to it like with my first few experiences, um to where you just see people come out of it, and like you're talking, you're doing your interviews, you're looking for imagery, you're looking for kind of like messaging and like that kind of stuff, and to know that this is something that's been done for generations just in different ways, and we got away from it and we became medicalized. And now I'm sitting here getting to talk about morality and ethics and your soul, and people are
Hmm.
like, yes.
Yeah.
Because we got away from it.
We got away from a lot of things, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
societally, right? Like with the advancements that we have, and like some are great and some are awful, and like we have to keep pivoting. But
Yeah.
I think that there is a tendency to pivot in that direction, like, oh, things are moving faster, so technology is faster, so we need to be working all the time. We need to be on our devices all the time, and now luckily, in a lot of these kind of more holistic wellness conversations and spaces and communities, it's like, hey, like less is more, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
case in point, like you're talking about microdosing, and I think most people listening in have heard the promising studies with treatment of trauma and things like that,
Yes.
with veterans as first responders with microdosing MDMA, things like that, right? Like, so we're not hopefully we're not sounding totally like space cadets. And I don't know a lot about it except for that the data is promising, and I've heard a lot of
Yes.
really educated, legitimate folks talk about it, and I am not one to really comment beyond that. However, I think that like even to where this conversation started, right, where we're talking
Mm-hmm.
about warrior culture and shame, and warrior culture being such a space and place of honor, and like you don't want to talk about where we've gotten away from that. Like that's the issue, right? Like we have for decades we've been publicly scorning and shaming those that are trying to protect us, like trying the best they
Yes.
can, and like we're gonna loop in like the highest level politicians as being like we're gonna basically have a soldier own that narrative. Like come on, like what ultimately we're in one of the, and of course I posted something about just reflections on like Veterans Day or Independence Day, as I generally do, about like freedom of speech and safety and security, and people are like, oh, you think it's safe to be, a person of XYZ in this nation? I'm like, the fact that you can say that and the fact that you can blast whoever the president is says a lot. Like
Right.
again, going
Proves my
back to that.
point.
So
Like,
yeah, so I don't want to go
proves the
down. Yeah,
point.
exactly. Yeah, and then not going to go down that rabbit hole. I think most people listening in will get what we're talking about.
Yeah.
But yeah, like how can we return to the old? And sometimes that is to celebrate. And like I've been trying to introduce this like notion on social, but also with my guys. I'm like, hey, like you guys went to a really rough call and you guys did a really good job. Like you should be proud. And I don't think that we talk a lot about being proud anymore. Like
Mm-hmm.
and pride, like deadly sin, right? Like no, just be proud that you did a good job and like be
Well,
proud of
because
you and your
socially, right? Like
people.
socially, the zeitgeist of the culture is to be anti-police,
Hmm.
anti-warrior. Like if you really think about Vietnam and like the veterans coming home, like those
Right.
guys, they
That's what I was
got
thinking about.
shit on.
Oh
Like
yeah.
they just started coming back into the fold of things like in the last 22 years since we've been in Iraq, 24 years almost. 23. So like they policing and the zeitgeist of the culture is like when somebody is telling you you're bad, you
Hmm.
start to embody it, and so then you can't
Yeah.
enjoy it, you can't enjoy those wins because it's like, well, I guess this was a good job, but they're not gonna fucking see it that way, right?
Yeah. And it feels that way. And I realize when I meet new people, like whether it's new neighbors or something, like I have a tenseness in me
Mm-hmm.
that's like, they're really nice right now. Is that going to change when they find out I'm a cop? Like
Yeah,
that's a really crappy thing to carry with you.
because
Right,
it
wrong,
didn't
or
used to be
indifferent.
like that. Yeah.
Didn't, yeah. And so I remember like, when I hired on like 17 years ago, right? Like people that I was riding along with were like, "You want to be a cop?" Like people don't like cops, but like that was like nothing in
Mm-hmm.
comparison to the kind of narratives now, right? And so, like it's something that you're right. Like you react to that and you're aware of it. So in some ways, like you feel dejected. In other ways, like it creates people to get defensive and like then they don't want to engage in the public. They don't want to. Um, if they have to address something, they come off defensive, or they don't want to build these bridges because they don't want to, empathize with the community that so much hates them. But none of these responses are correct, right? And
Mm-hmm.
they're understandable, and it's something that you can navigate through and find balance with yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone's going to be a little different how they approach that, but ultimately, I think that corrosive energy is just really, it's really contributory towards like the issues that a lot of law enforcement officers are facing with regard to wellness and resilience and MI and all these things we're talking about.
When we talked about moral injury being like a social issue, like a social relational issue, right? So when society is anti you and your logos and your emblems are protect and serve,
Hmm.
like protect and serve the society that hates me,
Yeah.
cool,
Yep.
cool. Um, so like it's one like you struck a chord because it was like, yeah, 17 years ago people don't like cops, true, and they respected them. Now people don't like cops and they don't respect the laws.
Hmm.
Like, and it's laws that you have to enforce, whether it's municipal, state, federal. Like we have laws in society that need enforcing. You are choosing to break those rules, those laws, and it's like this disagreement now where they have gone outside the social expectation of what we see as right, fair, moral, and just and ethical. And you, the enforcer, the warrior, is having to say no, and they're going and spitting in your face.
Hmm. Yeah.
Welcome to moral injury.
Yeah. So to kind of summarize and kind of repackage maybe some of these big takeaways for folks listening is like, yeah, feel your feelings, like recognize like what you're feeling. Beyond that, like how do you suggest people approach these types of conversations? I know some people are very much like, clinician advocates. They're like, hey, I got my person, I got my therapist or my counselor. But for those that aren't, you talked about debriefs. Like, do you have suggestions for how people may consider fighting back that sense to isolate? Because that's kind of what the crux of a lot of what we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds so simple, but like really find, if you don't want to find your clinician person, then find your battle buddy, right? Like find the buddy that's going to have your six regardless of
Hmm.
who it is, and if it's same department, different, first responder role. Like don't, yeah, just don't isolate. It's intuitive to want to cut off the gangrene limb, right? Or like the limb that's perceived as weak. And so if you think that that's you, you're going to try to isolate yourself from everybody else so you don't taint them. My challenge to that is let them tell you no. They would much rather you talk to them than respond to your crime scene.
Yeah. Yeah. And just something I'll throw out there is like, I love that you talk about like your battle buddy, same department, different department, right? Sometimes it is helpful to have that not isolation, but like the separation
Yeah.
from, your own like little micro tribe or the
Yeah.
politics and the drama. Sometimes it's like, no, that way I don't have to worry about like what I'm venting about, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I would also suggest that if you don't have your person or you wonder if, well, this isn't like a big enough thing. Well, yeah, it is because you're thinking about it. So, and even, Cop Line, Code 4 Northwest is like the regional kind of helpline for first responders up here. Every region has theirs and there's national ones for sure, right? So I would highly suggest like if something is bothering you, like don't think that you're not worth it. Don't think that you're like, well, I'm not suicidal or I'm not, maybe I'm more in that passive suicidal thing. I know it's not the
Mm-hmm.
best. I know it doesn't feel good, but like I'm not like holding the gun in my hand. I don't want it's not about that. Like it's affecting you. Like have a conversation, see where it goes, and maybe that little toe dip of an anonymous person makes you feel more comfortable to
Yeah.
continue on that, and maybe then you're like, hey, like I'm more open to a therapist now, right? Or I'm more open to talking to my peer support um, in my area. Like I think that just recognizing it's uncomfortable, but you're willing to try, like you should again be proud, right? Be proud of
Yeah.
that, like that little step you're taking.
And more departments, kind of in like what I do now, more and more departments are understanding the importance of mental health and wellness. And so there are states that have instituted mandatory wellness visits with a
Hmm.
mental health provider.
Yeah.
And like that's what I do now, as well as provide ongoing psychological support to first responders. Um, so a lot of them are getting, like, with me and the exposure to me as like a culturally competent provider, that the department like has said like, yep, we're going to see this person, and like confidentiality and privacy are very, very different. Oftentimes first responders, the only contact I've had with a provider is for like pre-employees and fitness for duties. And those, like, the confidentiality lives with the department in those. But for what we do with wellness visits and with psychotherapy in general, is the confidentiality is between me and that client sitting in front of me. The department knows nothing, the
Hmm.
content of what's discussed or anything like that. And they sign on the line that says, like, we're not going to press you for anything. So what we do, if I see somebody beyond like a wellness visit and the department has a budget for like shorter term support, we just bill as anonymous member, and they trust
Hmm.
us to
That's
do
cool.
that. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
really great.
Yeah.
I
That's.
wish more and more departments would do that. Like Illinois is mandatory for wellness visits, not for the ongoing support, but like more and more departments are understanding that the people that are coming in to their departments are more informed about their own mental health. Like that culture
Hmm.
has definitely changed. And so there's candidates shopping around for
Hmm.
departments, like which department cares most about its people and how does it care about its people. And if it's like we have a full bore mental wellness program where like you do wellness visits annually and you can see the psychologist that we contract with on a regular basis, like that's the department they're going to choose.
Mm-hmm.
And the benefit of what I do is that I'm not owned by a department. Like, I'm not embedded. I am totally separate. And that is
Yeah.
how we maintain our business, is by being separate, um, and not embedding. Like, embedded mental health is awesome. And there's some drawbacks to it depending on how contracts are written and like what the understanding is. Um, so I'm not going
Yeah.
to shit on it necessarily. It's just how we've chosen to operate.
Yeah, that's very cool, and I think that gives so many people like an opportunity to think about what may help their culture, right? And there's wellness coordinators that listen to this. There's peer support folks that are willing to run an idea up the chain, right? And so,
Mm-hmm.
we have been doing optional wellness visits for a while. I'm really proud of that, and I'm proud of our administration. I'm proud of our people for buying in. Proud of our union folks for like saying, yeah, like I talked to her, she's legit. The same time, like baby steps, right? Like I've heard and talked to clinicians like yourself that are such a fan of mandatory. I've talked to other first responders that have mandatory now, and they're such a
Yeah.
fan because of what it's doing to the culture. I know there's a lot of resistance of making people do something, even if the bosses are like, I'm full on in, but I just don't want to be the boss that now made somebody do something. So yeah, I think we're having the conversation, moving the needle, but
Yeah.
even to your point, like normalizing it, I feel like a huge win that our middle ground right now is mandatory for new people, right? You just
Mm-hmm.
have to meet the person. You could talk about whatever you want. You could sit there and receive training, and she may just tell you about some things to think about as you transition. Like that's awesome. And so just to remove that stigma, normalize it. There's a lot of ways to do that, and I appreciate you kind of highlighting some of the ways that people can
Mm-hmm.
think about it.
Well, clinicians, we love mandatory because it equalizes, right? It
Yes.
equalizes the
Yeah.
playing field and doesn't like say something's wrong with you. It's like, no, everybody goes. And just because you're not struggling doesn't mean that, Corporal or, police officer
Hmm.
John Smith is not struggling. And now
Right.
he has a way, or she has a way, to like talk to somebody without peers pointing the finger.
Yeah.
So like that's why we as clinicians really love the mandatory, because it's equal across the board. And like the way we do ours is like, you fulfilled your obligation by showing up. What you choose to say to me or not is totally beyond whatever. I'm going to introduce myself. I'm going to tell you about me. Our conversation is going to go where it wants to go. If you want to tell me to go fuck off, I'll go fuck off. Like,
Yeah.
job well done. Bravo. Like,
Yeah. But even
thanks for
then,
showing
I
up.
like, yeah, 100%. And I agree. Like, there's an opportunity to, like, you could call it training. How is it,
Yeah.
how it's not training? I don't even know how someone conceptualizes it's not training, where even if someone for 35, 40 minutes, 50 minutes, whatever it is, if you're like, hey, kindly, Dr. Rachel F off, I'm going to sit here with my arms crossed. And you're like, cool. Well, today, this quarter,
Right.
or this,
I'm gonna speak into your
yeah,
face.
we are talking about communicating with family at home,
Yeah.
like things to think about. Like that like they're if they got like a little nugget in there, or if they didn't, then they're better primed for the next time. They get a little
Yeah.
nugget in there. Like it is all helpful, and I do appreciate that note. About like the newest generation coming in, like they are the most emotionally intelligent, arguably, right? Like they're most aware of mental health issues. Like they talked about how bullying is bad. Like
Mm-hmm.
like that's just something you dealt with, right? That's like I'm
Yes.
still of the rub some dirt on it kind of generation, how I was raised. So like every generation for since forever has been called softer and softer. Well, like this
Mm,
one actually has arguably a lot of the best grounds to build this this resilient nature, and pay attention to your point, like to employers that are investing in wellness, like that does carry a lot of weight when you talk about first responder wellness, but also people analyzing the hiring climate, and like they're kind of picking their spot,
yep.
and that's very much a thing that people are aware of, so that's
Yeah.
fantastic. Like
Yeah. I mean, I love these opportunities like wellness visits. I love doing them just because it gets me in front of people and like offers an option for really great conversation. And more often than not, like there is something that ends up coming up, whether it's expected or unexpected, and then like they just schedule in. Like our website has it to where like they can just schedule themselves in and off we go. And I'm like, oh, they're back. Cool.
yeah,
What's up?
yeah, so good. Well, Dr. Rachel, we've covered a lot of ground, and I so much appreciate your time. Is there anything that you would like to leave the listeners with, and then
Mhm.
certainly how people can get in contact with you and learn more about, or reach back out to say, hey, like, hey, Doc, you mentioned this, like, where can I find out more?
Yeah. I think the thing I want to hit on most is the element of resiliency that gets overlooked is emotional intelligence. And the
Mm,
key to decreasing distress and elongating a career without losing yourself is to have emotional intelligence and to know when the struggle is too overwhelming and you are not living like a values congruent life. And for everybody that looks different, moral injury deviates you from those values. Uh, and so if you're feeling like that shame, that guilt, the wondering of purpose, the loss of trust in self, like pay really close attention to that and talk to somebody. Because if, like I said, the idea of grief and loss is very real in that because it looks different for everybody. And there's a loss of trust and loss of like love for yourself and love for society and the people that you're protecting and serving. Um, and then our website is thinlinepsychology.com. I'm located in Wisconsin. You can feel free to email me at Goldmann, Goldmann, at thinlinepsychology.com. And I will get back to you and we can talk all things moral injury. I have a really great presentation that I can do as well. So that's, I think, covers it, right?
yeah, awesome. Well, thank you again so much. And the info will be in the show notes as far as where the website, and if you're driving, don't feel like you need to
Keep your
don't
hands on the
text and
wheel.
drive. Yeah. Keep driving. Just look at the show notes later. Yeah, thanks so much. And we'll have to talk more and give out more information in
Love
time.
it. Yeah, thank you so much for the conversation.
Thank you for tuning into another episode of Blue Grit Radio. As always, support this community by subscribing, giving us a 5-star review, and following, liking, and sharing posts on Blue Grit Wellness on Instagram. You can reach me there or email me at bluegritwellness@gmail.com. Be well and stay gritty.